Life had a funny way of painting over the cracks, hiding imperfections until they couldn't be ignored. I had to remind myself of this often. Looking back, my marriage to Rose seemed like a dream everyone envied. But if you paid attention, the signs were always there, small, subtle, and easy to dismiss. Rose and I were high school sweethearts, meeting in the hallways of our small-town school. I was the quiet, free-spirited kid, not really fitting into any specific crowd. She, on the other hand, was a daydreamer, always talking about escaping the monotony of our town, searching for something more. Our connection seemed inevitable. We were opposites, but somehow we clicked. After graduation, life took us on separate paths. I went off to study agricultural business, hoping to run my own farm one day. Rose went to a city college to study accounting. For a few years, our worlds didn't overlap. I focused on learning the ins and outs of my trade, while Rose thrived in her career. She had a sharp mind for numbers, but her heart still longed for excitement and adventure beyond the confines of her reality. Fast forward a few years, and there she was, sitting across the desk from me in the local bank. She was my new bank coordinator, handling my finances with a steady hand and a smile that brought back every memory I'd buried. The conversation was awkward at first, small talk, laughs that didn't sound quite real, but eventually we fell back into an easy rhythm. It didn't take long for us to reconnect. Soon enough, coffee meetings became dinners, and dinners became long drives out of town, talking about everything we missed. The sparks reignited faster than either of us expected. Before long, I proposed. She said yes, of course, and we found ourselves locked in a marriage that felt, at least on the surface, perfect. The farm was successful, thanks to my hard work and a bit of luck, and with Rose managing our finances, we never had to worry about money. She even started her own business with the support I provided, a venture that flourished under her meticulous management. We bought a nice house in a quiet neighborhood. People often said we were the ideal couple, successful, happy, and, from the outside, unshakable. But every story has a shadow. Our lives weren't as pristine as they seemed. Rose's yearning for excitement never truly went away. I saw it in the way her eyes wandered when we were at parties, or how she stayed a little too long at work functions, engrossed in conversations with strangers. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I trusted her. We had built a life together after all. I thought her longing for adventure was just a remnant of the restless girl I had fallen in love with. But as time passed, small things started to feel off. She would come home late more often, brushing it off with excuses that didn't seem quite right. She became secretive with her phone, quick to put it face down when I walked by. I wasn't one to confront issues head-on, especially when it came to Rose. I loved her deeply, even if a part of me knew something was wrong. I reasoned that maybe it was just a phase, a midlife itch, a desire for something more than the daily routine we had fallen into. After all, everyone gets bored sometimes, right? But then there were the nights when she didn't come home at all, claiming she had stayed with a friend because she didn't want to wake me. And the whispered phone calls, the sudden business trips she hadn't mentioned until the last minute. Slowly, doubts began creeping in, no longer something I could brush aside. I tried to rationalize everything. She was busy, successful, and sometimes needed her space. I convinced myself that we were just going through a rough patch, the kind every couple faces. The thought of Rose betraying me was too painful to even consider. Still, that nagging feeling lingered. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder it got. As the months dragged on, the signs became harder to ignore. Rose was drifting further away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. The woman I once knew, the woman who was full of life, excitement, and dreams, she was still there, but she felt distant. It was like she was walking through the motions of our life, but her heart had wandered somewhere else. I tried to fix things. I really did. I made an effort to bring back the spark. We'd go on date nights, I'd surprise her with small gestures, flowers for no reason, her favorite wine on Fridays. I wanted to remind her of the life we had built, of the love we shared. For a while, it seemed like it might be working. She'd smile more, engage in our conversations, and we even made plans for a weekend getaway, just the two of us. But it always felt forced, like she was playing a part in a script she no longer believed in. Then there was Faith. Rose's eyes always lit up when we talked about her, our daughter. She was the one thing that kept Rose grounded. At least that's what I told myself. Faith was in high school now, a beautiful, talented girl with so much potential. She was the best part of both of us. Rose's determination and my love for simple, honest work. Faith adored her mother, and I think that's why I hesitated to act on my suspicions. I didn't want to tear apart the family we had built, not when Faith needed us to be strong for her, but there were still things I couldn't ignore. I remember one night, Rose came home late again. It had become a regular thing by then, and I had stopped asking where she had been. This time, though, something was different. She was in a good mood, almost too good. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was a lightness to her step that I hadn't seen in years. It was like she had just come back from some secret, exhilarating adventure. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she was tired, and headed upstairs without another word. I sat there on the couch, staring at the empty wine glass in front of me, feeling a weight settle in my chest. Something had changed in her. The thought gnawed at me, and no matter how hard I tried to brush it aside, it wouldn't leave. The next morning, I found myself in the kitchen, making coffee and staring out the window. I could hear Rose upstairs getting ready for work. The house was quiet, too quiet. Faith was at school, and for a moment, I felt completely alone. The silence weighed heavy, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live like this, constantly wondering, constantly doubting. I started paying more attention, looking for the little things that didn't add up. I noticed how Rose's phone never seemed to leave her side anymore. It was always locked, always face down on the table. She was more secretive, disappearing for hours at a time with vague excuses about work meetings or last-minute errands. I caught her texting late at night, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen, but she would immediately close the phone whenever I walked into the room. Then, there were the conversations she wasn't having with me. The distance between us had grown into an unspoken barrier, a wall that I couldn't seem to break through. Our once lively discussions about everything from the farm to our future had been reduced to mundane, surface-level exchanges. How was your day? Fine. Did you see Faith's grades? She's doing well. What should we have for dinner? Maybe pasta. It felt like I was living with a stranger. The woman I loved, the one I had married, wasn't there anymore. One day, out of the blue, a man named Bobby joined her business. I had never heard of him before, but he was suddenly everywhere. Rose would mention him in passing, how helpful he was, how he was taking on more responsibilities so she could focus on growing the company. At first, I didn't think much of it. Bobby was just her assistant, or at least that's what she said. But soon, his name started coming up more and more. I'd hear her talking to him on the phone, laughing in a way that sounded too familiar for a simple work relationship. When I'd ask about it, she'd brush it off, saying Bobby was just good at his job and they had a lot of work to get through. She was trying to expand the business, after all. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things, but deep down, I knew there was more to the story. The turning point came during one of our rare dinners out. We were at a nice restaurant, one of those places we used to love going to before life got too busy. I had hoped it would be a chance for us to reconnect, to talk about things that mattered, but as the night went on, I could feel her slipping away again. She was distant, checking her phone under the table, barely engaging in the conversation. I remember looking at her, really looking at her, and realizing that I didn't know this person anymore. She was sitting across from me, but her mind was somewhere else. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was staring me in the face. Rose was no longer mine. She hadn't been for a long time. Then came the final blow. As we were leaving the restaurant, we ran into someone Rose hadn't expected to see, Bobby. He was there with his wife, a woman I had never met. The way Rose stiffened when she saw him told me everything I needed to know. Bobby's wife gave Rose a strange look, almost as if she knew something I didn't. The whole encounter was awkward, tense, like a scene from a movie where everyone knows the plot except for the clueless husband. That night, as we drove home in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. The cracks in our marriage had widened into a chasm, and I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back. I wasn't ready for the truth, but deep down, I knew it was coming. The truth has a way of creeping up on you, slowly at first, until it finally smacks you in the face. And that night, after running into Bobby and his wife, the mask that had been holding my marriage together finally crumbled. It started with small things. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the way Rose had reacted to seeing Bobby, how her body had stiffened, and the tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while she slept next to me, completely oblivious, or pretending to be. I needed answers. The tension was eating away at me, making it impossible to function. The next day, after Rose left for work, I did something I had never done before. I snooped. I felt like an idiot, skulking around my own house like a burglar, but I couldn't stop myself. I went through her things, searching for something, anything, that would explain the distance between us. Her phone was locked, of course, and I didn't have the passcode, but her laptop was left open on the kitchen counter. I sat down, my hands trembling as I pulled up her emails. For a moment, I hesitated, guilt gnawing at me. This was wrong. I shouldn't be invading her privacy like this. But then, I thought about all the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the excuses. I deserved to know the truth. I scrolled through her inbox, looking for something out of place. There were the usual work emails, messages from clients, and updates on her business. But then I saw it. A string of emails from Bobby, far too many for a simple work relationship. Most of them were innocuous at first glance, meeting times, project updates, but there was something about the tone that felt off, too familiar, too personal. And then I found the one that changed everything. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. I'll make up an excuse to see you again tomorrow. My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over, hoping I was misunderstanding, that somehow this was all just a horrible mistake. But deep down, I knew. I had known for a while. The email was from 2 weeks ago, one of those nights she'd come home late, claiming she had stayed at the office to finish a big project. My blood boiled. How long had this been going on? How many times had she looked me in the eye, smiled, and lied straight to my face? I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand answers. But I wasn't ready. I needed more proof, more clarity. I couldn't just accuse her without knowing the full extent of what had been happening behind my back. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on anything except the betrayal. The house felt like a cage, and everywhere I looked, I saw the life we had built together, pictures of us on the mantel, our wedding photo in the hallway, reminders of a past that now felt like a cruel joke. That evening, I couldn't even bring myself to look at her. When she came home, acting as if everything was normal, my stomach turned. How could she pretend like this, like nothing had changed, like she wasn't sneaking around with another man? Over the next few days, I began to watch her more closely. Every smile, every gesture, every word she said felt like a lie. I started paying attention to the small details, how she always seemed to be texting someone when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she'd slip out for hours without a clear explanation. She was hiding something, and now I knew what it was. I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. That's when I made the decision to hire a private investigator. I didn't want to at first. It felt like a betrayal of my own, a violation of the trust we were supposed to have in each other. But Rose had broken that trust long before I did. I needed to know the full truth, no matter how painful. It didn't take long for the investigator to find what I already suspected. Within a week, I had photos, video footage, and phone records that laid everything bare. Rose and Bobby had been seeing each other for months. They met in secret, in hotels out of town, careful to keep their affair hidden from prying eyes. But nothing stays hidden forever. The day I received the final report, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. There it was, in black and white, evidence of her infidelity, photos of them together, looking far too intimate for a simple business relationship. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, the proof of their betrayal staring back at me. I sat there for hours, unable to move, unable to think. Everything we had built together, every memory, every promise, felt like a lie. I had given her everything, my love, my trust, my support, and she had thrown it all away for him. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the phone rang. It was Bobby's wife. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tight with anger and pain. "We need to meet. It's about Rose and Bobby." I didn't know what to expect when I agreed to meet her. Part of me hoped she was wrong, that maybe this was all a misunderstanding, but the rational part of my brain knew better. We met at a quiet cafe, on the edge of town, a place far enough away from the prying eyes of our community. Bobby's wife was beautiful, in a cold, sharp sort of way. She sat across from me, her lips pursed, her eyes filled with the kind of fury I had been holding back for days. "You know, don't you?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "They've been screwing around behind our backs for months," she said, her words dripping with venom. "I found out weeks ago. Bobby's a liar, but he's also stupid. He left his phone out one night, and I went through it. That's how I found out about your wife." I couldn't bring myself to respond. The pain of hearing it from someone else, of knowing that another person had been dragged into this mess, was too much to bear. "I'm going to confront him," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet rage. "He needs to pay for what he's done. And your wife? She's no better." I felt like I was suffocating. The walls were closing in, and the weight of everything came crashing down on me. There was no going back now. The betrayal was out in the open, and there was no way to undo it. As I sat there, numb and silent, Bobby's wife leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "You deserve to know something else," she said quietly. "It's not just Bobby. There have been others." Her words hit me like a freight train. Her words echoed in my head, turning everything I thought I knew into dust. There have been others. The air in the cafe felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in around me. I stared at Bobby's wife, trying to process what she had just said, but my mind refused to cooperate. "What do you mean, others?" I finally managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She leaned back in her chair, her expression cold and unflinching. "Rose hasn't been faithful to you for a long time. Bobby's not the first, and I doubt he'll be the last. She's been running around with other men for years. I've heard rumors. There are always rumors in a small town, but I didn't pay attention until I found out about her and my husband. Now, I see it for what it is. Well, let's just say she's made a habit of it." My stomach churned. I had come to this meeting prepared to hear the worst about Rose and Bobby, but this was more than I could handle. The idea that my wife, the woman I had built my life with, had been sleeping with other men while I was none the wiser. How could I have been so blind? Bobby's wife, whose name I learned was Christine, seemed to sense my turmoil. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said, her voice a little softer now. "But I thought you deserved to know. I'm going to confront Bobby tonight. I don't know what I'm going to do after that, but I'm done. You should be too. I nodded, though I couldn't summon the strength to speak. The meeting ended shortly after, and I drove home in a haze, my thoughts racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind kept replaying everything Christine had told me, the idea of others gnawing at me like a relentless parasite. When I got home, Rose was in the kitchen, humming to herself while she cooked dinner, like it was any other night. She turned and smiled when she saw me, but I could barely look at her without feeling sick. How could she act so normal, so innocent, when she had been betraying me for God knows how long? I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I didn't have the strength, not with everything I had just learned. Instead, I did what I had always done. I buried the anger, the hurt, and pretended that nothing was wrong. We ate dinner in near silence, with Rose occasionally making small talk about her day and Faith's upcoming school projects. I nodded along, giving short answers, but my mind was a million miles away. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a whirlwind of emotions, anger, disbelief, heartbreak. I couldn't stop thinking about what Christine had said. Had Rose really been unfaithful to me with multiple men? Was Bobby just the latest in a long string of affairs? I had no way of knowing, and the not knowing was killing me. The next few days were a blur. Rose went about her life as if nothing had changed, but I couldn't look at her without feeling a deep sense of betrayal. I couldn't shake the image of her with another man. No, other men. It was like a poison in my veins, spreading through every part of me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. And then, the confrontation I had been dreading finally happened. It was a Friday night, a week after my meeting with Christine. I was in the living room pretending to watch TV while Rose sat on the other end of the couch, scrolling through her phone. Faith was at a friend's house for a sleepover, so it was just the two of us. The tension in the room was thick, though Rose seemed oblivious, completely absorbed, in whatever she was doing on her phone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to hear it from her. "Rose," I said, my voice tight. She looked up, surprised by the sudden seriousness in my tone. "Yeah? I need to ask you something," I continued, my heart pounding in my chest. "And I need you to be honest with me." Her eyes flickered with something. Fear? Guilt? It was hard to tell. She set her phone down slowly, her smile faltering. "Okay, what's going on?" I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what I was about to say. "Are you having an affair with Bobby?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Rose's face went pale, and for a moment she didn't say anything. I watched her carefully, searching for any sign of the truth in her expression. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "Charlie, just tell me the truth." I cut her off, my voice harsher than I intended. "I know something's going on, Rose. I've known for a while." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "It's complicated." I could feel the anger rising in me, my hands clenching into fists. "Complicated? You've been lying to me for months, maybe years, and it's complicated?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I couldn't feel sorry for her. Not now, not after everything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been seeing Bobby." It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. Even though I already knew the answer, hearing her admit it out loud made it real in a way that the emails and photos hadn't. She had betrayed me. She had been sleeping with another man, all while smiling at me, pretending everything was fine. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold. She swallowed hard, wiping at her eyes. "A few months." I shook my head, disgusted. "And what about the others?" Rose froze, her eyes widening in shock. "What are you talking about?" "Christine told me everything," I said, my words dripping with anger. "She said Bobby isn't the first. She said you've been sleeping with other men." The color drained from Rose's face. "That's not true," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, standing up and towering over her. "I deserve the truth. After everything you've done, the least you can do is be honest with me." For a moment, she just stared at me, her lips trembling. Then, finally, she broke. "It was only one other," she admitted, her voice shaking. "It was a long time ago, before Bobby. It didn't mean anything. I swear I felt like I was going to be sick. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life with, had been unfaithful to me not once, but twice. And who knows if there were more. She had been lying to me for so long, how could I ever trust anything she said?" "Who?" I demanded, my voice cold and detached, like I wasn't even in my own body anymore. "It doesn't matter," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Charlie, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. I love you. I never meant for any of this to happen, but her words meant nothing to me now. The damage was done. I had loved her with everything I had, and she had thrown it all away. Her tears, her apologies, they washed over me like rain on a tin roof, noisy but meaningless. The weight of her confession had already sunk into my bones, leaving me hollow. Rose's words were drowned out by the rushing in my ears, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding like a war drum. She had said enough. No matter what she claimed, no matter how much she begged, the truth was already out. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, wondering how she could sit there, pleading for my forgiveness after everything she had done. I wasn't even angry anymore. Just empty. "I'll ask you one last time," I said, my voice low and cold. "Who was the other man?" Rose buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as sobs racked her body. "Charlie, please. It doesn't matter anymore. It was a mistake. It was just once." "Who was it?" I interrupted, my patience long gone. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I could see the panic in her face, the desperation to keep this last piece of her secret from crumbling. But there was no point. The damage was done. The truth was inevitable. It was a colleague," she finally whispered. "From my old firm. His name was Evan. The name meant nothing to me. Some faceless man from her past. One of many, I suspected. But it didn't matter who he was. What mattered was that she had cheated on me long before Bobby ever entered the picture. She had been unfaithful for years, and I had been living a lie the entire time. I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me as the weight of her betrayal pressed down on my chest. I needed air. I needed to get out of this house, away from her, before I said or did something I would regret. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice hollow. Rose stood up, panic flashing across her face. "Wait, Charlie, please, don't leave. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can talk about it. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, I swear." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Make this right? Rose, you've been lying to me for years. You slept with another man, maybe more. You let me believe that we were happy, that everything was fine, while you were sneaking around behind my back. There's nothing left to fix." She tried to reach for me, her hand trembling, but I stepped back. I couldn't bear to have her touch me. "Please, Charlie," she begged, her voice breaking. "I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you. We can get through this." I stared at her, feeling nothing but contempt. "Love? You call this love? If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to my face every day for years. You love yourself, Rose. You love the thrill, the excitement, but you don't love me." Her face crumpled, and she sank to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. But her tears couldn't reach me. The connection we once had was severed, broken beyond repair. I walked to the door, grabbing my jacket and keys. "I'll be staying at a hotel for a while. Don't call me, don't text me. I need time to think." Before she could respond, I was out the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but it wasn't enough to shake the numbness that had settled over me. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing but stuck on one thought. My life, my marriage, had been a lie. I eventually found myself parked in front of a dingy motel on the edge of town, the kind of place no one looks twice at. It was perfect. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to be found. I just wanted to disappear. The room was as depressing as you'd expect. Faded wallpaper, a lumpy bed, and a flickering TV that looked like it hadn't worked properly in years. But it was quiet, and that was all I needed. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind still replaying Rose's confession on an endless loop. I thought about all the years we had spent together, the life we had built, the plans we had made. And now, it was all gone. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted more than anyone else in the world, had shattered everything. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely left the motel, only venturing out for food or to clear my head with a walk around the parking lot. My phone buzzed constantly with messages and missed calls from Rose, but I ignored them all. I didn't want to hear her voice. I didn't want to be dragged back into the mess she had created. It wasn't until day 5 that I finally made a decision. I couldn't stay in limbo forever. I needed to confront this head-on, even if it meant tearing my entire life apart. I had called my lawyer the day after I left, explaining the situation and asking for advice on how to proceed. He was sympathetic, but professional, laying out my options for divorce. Divorce. The word still felt foreign on my tongue, like a weight I wasn't ready to carry. But it was the only path forward now. There was no saving our marriage, not after everything that had happened. I needed to protect myself. I had seen enough men get screwed over in divorces, losing everything they worked for because they were too angry or too emotional to think clearly. I wouldn't let that happen to me. Rose might have been the one to betray me, but I wasn't going to let her take everything I had worked for. I was smarter than that. I met with the lawyer a few days later, going over the details of our assets, the house, the business, the investments. With his guidance, I began taking steps to protect what was mine. I had supported Rose through her career, helped her build her business, but now I needed to make sure she didn't walk away with more than she deserved. While I was dealing with the legal side of things, Rose continued to call and text, leaving desperate voicemails pleading for me to come home. I couldn't stand to listen to them. Every word felt like another knife in my chest. She didn't love me. She loved the life we had built, the image we projected. And now that it was crumbling, she was grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something she had already destroyed. I didn't speak to her until everything was in place. It was a cold, calculated move, but it was necessary. When I finally went home, it wasn't to reconcile. It was to end things. When I walked through the door, the house felt different, quieter, darker. Rose was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked up at me, her face full of hope, but I didn't let her speak. "I've filed for divorce," I said, my voice steady but emotionless. "You'll be served papers soon. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and I suggest you do the same." Her face crumpled again, and she stood up, rushing toward me. "No, Charlie, please. We can work this out. We can—" "No, we can't," I interrupted, stepping back to avoid her touch. "It's over, Rose. It's been over for a long time. You just didn't want to admit it." She sank back into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory, just emptiness. I turned and left the house without another word, knowing that this chapter of my life was finally closed. In the days following my final decision, the weight of everything began to settle in. Divorce. The word itself felt cold and definitive, as if the life Rose and I had built was nothing more than a contract to be dissolved, signatures on paper, a memory erased. But in reality, the scars were far deeper, more permanent. The house felt like a museum now, echoes of a life that once seemed perfect, but was, in reality, built on lies. I moved out for good, leaving behind the memories, the carefully curated images of a happy marriage, the place that once felt like home. I rented an apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest place that suited me fine. It wasn't home yet, but at least it wasn't full of ghosts. I didn't see Rose much after that. She signed the divorce papers without much of a fight, though I suspect she realized there was no point. The evidence was damning. My lawyer had ensured that I would be protected, that the assets we shared would be split fairly, not generously, but fairly. It wasn't about revenge. I just wanted to walk away with what was mine. I thought that after the papers were signed, after the house was divided and the accounts split, I would feel some kind of closure. But that never came. Instead, there was only a hollow space where my marriage used to be. I had given so much of myself to Rose, to the life we had built, that when it was all gone, I didn't know what was left of me. Faith, our daughter, was the only thing that kept me going. She had taken the news hard, but I knew she would be okay. She was stronger than she realized, stronger than both of us, and I vowed to be there for her in every way I could. Faith was the one part of my life that still felt real, still felt pure. But things were different between us now, too. The day Bobby's wife, Christine, had exposed Rose's affair, Faith had been caught in the crossfire. Bobby, in a fit of rage and desperation, had confronted Rose at our house, and Faith had walked in on it. Things escalated quickly. Bobby shoved Faith when she tried to intervene, and she fell hard, hitting her head on the kitchen counter. I had rushed home from the motel as soon as I got the call, my heart pounding in my chest. Faith had been taken to the hospital, and I sat by her side, feeling powerless and filled with guilt. Rose had been beside herself, hysterical with fear and guilt, but by then, I couldn't even look at her. Faith was the only thing that mattered now. Thankfully, Faith survived the ordeal with only a concussion and a few bruises, but the emotional scars were much deeper. The experience had shaken her, and she couldn't understand why everything had fallen apart so quickly. I tried to explain, but how do you explain to your child that the person they looked up to, the person who was supposed to be their role model, had betrayed their family? Faith pulled away from Rose after that. Their relationship, once so close, was strained. She chose to live with me after the divorce, and although I didn't stop her from seeing her mother, it was clear that Faith blamed Rose for everything. It was hard to watch, but I knew Rose had made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. As for Bobby, his downfall was swift and brutal. After the attack on Faith, I pressed charges. He ended up in prison for assault, and his marriage to Christine fell apart soon after. She had wasted no time filing for divorce, and I heard through the grapevine that she had taken everything. Bobby's reputation, his career, and his freedom were gone. In some twisted way, it felt like justice, but it didn't bring me any peace. Months passed, and life slowly started to settle into a new kind of normal. I focused on the farm, throwing myself into the work to keep from thinking about the past. The land was mine, a piece of stability in a world that had turned upside down. I found solace in the rhythm of it, the predictability of planting, growing, and harvesting. At least the land didn't lie. And then there was Cindy. I hadn't expected to meet anyone new, especially not so soon after the divorce. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. Cindy was different from Rose in every possible way. She wasn't glamorous or flashy. She was quiet, grounded, and kind. We met when she came to the farm looking for work. She had recently gone through a rough patch herself, lost her job, her home, and was struggling to get back on her feet. At first, it was just business. I hired her to help with the bookkeeping and some light farm work. She was efficient, reliable, and, more importantly, she didn't pry into my personal life. But as time passed, we grew closer. She had a warmth to her that I hadn't realized I was missing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cindy became a part of my life, not as a replacement for Rose, but as something new, something real. Cindy didn't judge me for the mistakes I had made or the baggage I carried. She was patient, understanding, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. We didn't rush things. I wasn't ready to dive back into a relationship, and neither was she. But we spent time together, building something slow and steady, something that felt more like a partnership than the illusion I had lived with Rose. As the months turned into years, I watched Faith blossom into a strong, independent woman. She graduated high school with honors and went off to college on a scholarship. I couldn't have been prouder of her, despite everything she had been through. She rarely spoke to Rose, though, and I knew that rift might never fully heal. Rose, for her part, tried to rebuild her life. Her business had taken a hit after the scandal, but she managed to keep it afloat. She lived alone now, in a smaller house on the other side of town. We kept our interactions civil for Faith's sake, but there was no warmth left between us. I had moved on, and Rose, well, she had to live with the consequences of her choices. Years later, I found myself standing at the edge of a new chapter in my life. Cindy and I had grown closer, and she had become not just a part of the farm, but a part of my heart. It wasn't the whirlwind romance I had once thought love was supposed to be. It was better. It was steady, dependable, like the land beneath my feet. One morning, I stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the fields. Cindy came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. I didn't say anything, but in that moment, I knew something I hadn't been sure of in years. I was home. Charlie was gone, replaced by a man who had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. But I was still standing, stronger than ever, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the future was mine to write. As for Rose, I couldn't say. She had faded into the background of my life, a distant memory. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world was still, I'd think of her. Not with anger or bitterness, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. She had been a part of my story, but not the end of it. The last time I saw her was at Faith's college graduation. She stood at the edge of the crowd, alone, watching as our daughter received her diploma. I caught her eye for a brief moment, and she gave me a small, sad smile. I nodded, and then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. And that was the end of it.